whenever there was a kid that showed any interest in getting on an airplane, tried to spend time in the cockpit the best we could.
Mm-hmm.
That always made an impression. It's funny who you reach sometimes, but that was the way to do it. Of course, the adage was, when you grow up, do you want to be a pilot? The answer is you can't do both.
From Earhart Innovation Series, this is What Follows with Nate Thuli.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to What Follows, the podcast where we explore the people shaping aviation today and the ideas defining what comes next. I'm your host, Nate Thuli. I'm really pleased to have on the show today Les Abend, longtime contributing editor for Flying Magazine and one of the most recognizable voices in aviation. Les is best known for his widely read Jump Seat column, a candid, behind-the-scenes look at life on the flight deck, and that has become an essential reading for pilots and aviation enthusiasts alike. His perspective is grounded in decades of real-world experience as a Boeing 777 captain for American Airlines, including many international routes over the course of 30 years. Through his writing, Les has a rare ability to translate the realities of commercial aviation and the decisions and pressures and risk assessment and culture of a cockpit into compelling and accessible stories. In this episode, we explore his journey as an airline captain, what got him into the world of aviation, and sort of this ongoing second career as a voice in aviation as well. We unpack safety and accessibility, and we have an exclusive look at the recent Air Canada collision and some of the underlying information that we have available going on with that as well, and how we can then make the world of aviation continuously more accessible and safer. So with that, let's jump in. All right, here we go. Les, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here, Nate.
Hey, so before we jump into Jump Seat, which I'd love to talk about a little bit, and then unpack a little bit more, you've spent decades flying, and to include wide body captain and check airman, and then now sort of the second act as a writer and really a voice in aviation. I'd love to roll it back a little bit. What kind of first got you into aviation, and how do you think the path sort of wove its way to then being a voice in the world?
Well, what got me into aviation was just, it started out with poor judgment and bad skills. But I think that there was what got me into aviation, believe it or not, and I do tell a story a lot, is a certificate I received when I was 6 years old, and said that I'd climbed aboard a Lockheed Electra, which you can see over my right shoulder. And essentially, my spirited mother pushed me into the cockpit and said, "Say hi to the pilots." I received a certificate from the captain signed by him that said I could appear for an interview 20 years from that date.
No kidding.
In essence, I never got over it, which my parents, I think, were hoping for, but it never quite happens.
Interesting. I love the future side of that. I remember one of my first ones was, again, appeared in the cockpit, and I got the little plastic wings, I think the American Airlines wings.
I've given many of those out. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And I wore those all over the place, but I've never seen the interview into the future aspect. That's incredible. Did you hold on to that certificate?
Yeah, I still have it in this office I'm talking to you from. Yes, I did. And it was, if you take it a step further, when I got beyond 6 years old, there was something about the quality of the company, the airline, that said, hey, we care about what our future is going to look like. And to me, that was a class act. And I never got American Airlines out of my head. As a matter of fact, I told my high school guidance counselor, not only did I want to be an airline pilot, I wanted to be a captain for America. There you go.
Oh, there you go. And so the original certificate, that was an American Airlines flight then, I assume.
It was. Yeah.
Wow. Very cool.
I'm Lockheed Electra. Yeah.
Wow. And those haven't been flying for a while. That's
No, they have sort of a sordid history, but they were really, once they straightened out some issues with them, they were a pretty reliable airplane. But they didn't have a long shelf life with most of the airlines. Eastern had them, American had them. Yeah.
So now fast forward, you're in the plane, you're building this career flying, but somehow you chose to kind of weave in the stories, weave in the narrative, weave in the conversation that goes with that. And I would argue that kind of opens the audience wider than just pilots, right? How did that transition go? And have you seen that aperture open up over time?
It's a great way to ask the question, but it more or less paralleled with my career as an airline pilot from the standpoint of when I went to see that high school guidance counselor, she started throwing out papers that involved English, anything that involved writing, so on and so forth. And she said, this is the direction you should go. And I enjoyed writing even at the time. I wrote a little novelette when I was 6 years old. So I always thought that, you know what, maybe I can be an author and an airline pilot at the same time. So my objective when I got to flying was that, you know what, in order to write a book that's successful, I need to have some name recognition. And the magazine potentially would provide me with that. Not necessarily worked out that way, but 25 years later, I'm still writing for the magazine. And I did publish one book, a novel.
Right.
There you go.
Congratulations on the book too. That's very cool. You and I were actually chatting a week or two ago prior to this, and you brought up your aero and kind of the reliability side of things. And then I noticed a recent jump seat write up on unpacking that a little bit more. And so you kind of get into the practicality of it a little bit. Have you noticed any kind of themes over the years of, hey, these are some big items that what I'm getting at kind of is, friction to flying more. A lot of us, when I was first introduced to aviation, I had this idea of, hey, I could get in the plane and I could go fly to here and I can go fly to here. And I just saw this as a way of making the world smaller and a way of doing all of this type of travel. And over time, not only has my risk aversion profile kind of changed, but also, you start to see some of the friction to that, and it kind of hits at this accessibility a little bit. But outside of just reliability, what other things have you been seeing?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting. As a career, I've more or less focused on the mission because the mission was important. I had people behind me that were dependent upon me getting them there safely, right? Now I'm focused more on the journey. Right? It's more of an enjoyable experience. And what doesn't make it enjoyable, you referred to, I think, a column that I wrote about reliability, mechanical reliability. Thanks so much for bringing it up, because now I'm in my 9th week of my avionics shop not having the airplane ready for me. So
9 weeks.
But it's a good frame of reference because the instrumentation and the avionics essentially and the technology that's involved is almost comparable to the jet that I retired off, the 777.
Interesting.
And that will help with the reliability aspect. And, it will, listen, it's a single engine airplane. So there's a comfort level that I have in flying in strictly instrument flight rules weather, IFR weather. Mm-hmm. Essentially being in the clouds, but it will open up the doors a little bit more into my comfort level on what I'm willing to fly in, perhaps. That said, I think we brought up a point when we spoke about the aspect of general aviation, which you are focusing on with your product development, is we're dealing with airframes that are, on average now over 50 years old, like my airplane. And they have different configurations as far as the avionics are concerned. So even if you put the newest technology into these things, it's how do they integrate with maybe what's left of the analog? How do they integrate within the panel? Because they're not all the same, where in my career, I was used to uniformity. So not only was it uniformity, in procedures and so on and so forth, every 777 for the most part, even the 727 I flew initially, were uniform in their instrumentation, and you understood the integration of how procedures work based on that instrumentation. The problem is with general aviation, you don't have that consistency, that uniformity. And what I found out is that, for instance, Garmin, who is is one of the major producers and innovators of these newer products, makes a lot of reference to the installer, which is your avionics. And it puts the onus on them to explain what they're installing. And I don't think that's fair. Yeah. And I don't think it's safe necessarily. I don't know if I brought this up at the time, but, I started going through YouTube videos just so I could see what the interaction is with pilots and the stuff that I bought for stupid money. There was one YouTube video that sort of set me back, and the gentleman was getting great information from the installer, but the installer was explaining the system to him, where I thought, where were you when the pilot's guide was available to download? So
Yeah, interesting.
we all, as a professional, this was, it's a non-starter. You don't show up for training unless you've already done some advanced research and book and study work on your own. So
Right,
that's one
right.
aspect. And now the other aspect is, well, let's take somebody that actually does take the time to study the manual, to
Mm-hmm.
read the pilot's guides, and then gets into that cockpit. Well, how do you train that person for the integration of that instrumentation? Even so, because there's no one size fits all. There's no template for it. And even an instructor, even if you're conscientious enough to get an instructor, that instructor has to be trained in it as well.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing else, more specifically, being proficient in it. And how do you bridge that gap? And I found that interesting, taking GA, general aviation, and commercial aviation, and
Mm-hmm.
looking at the parallels and how to make them equivalently safer.
Yeah, gosh. So you just unpacked or started to unpack so many threads woven together that I just love it. And you ended with the big S word, right, of safety and integration. Because not only are you talking about system level integration of, hey, you know what, this front end display needs and series of displays needs to integrate with where that information's coming from, how it's being computed, but integrating with there's an aircraft in that loop, right, and the panel or the avionics system is conveying information, but at the end of the day, there are laws of physics that are kind of influencing what that aircraft physically does, and there's sort of an integration or translation layer. But then there's a really big other area in there, and that's the human that's sitting there looking at that and processing the data coming forward and actually managing the aircraft. And you're right, especially in the world of GA, not only do we have sort of this collision of worlds of sort of modern tech trying to integrate with oftentimes airframes that are, to your point, 40, 50 years old. It's very, very, very real number in that case. But then even in airspace that sort of has two worlds that would need to work together. There's sort of this mission-oriented air transport, high efficiency, optimize profile type of airspace going on. But then also this world of much slower, more recreational GA. And that culminates at not only is integration really hard, and it's funny you're talking about that because behind me is the Earhart hangar, and right now there is an aircraft getting integrated with our system, and we're seeing that collision of world happening literally 50 feet away. Getting that right is how we address safety, right? And making it something that not only performs, but it ensures a good outcome, and I love that you talked about training with that. It's there's a lot to that. So what are some things that we can do to get that integration right? What are some, I guess, sort of some perspectives that we should maybe have looking at that?
Well, one of the things that is the mentality, right, of perhaps a GA pilot versus, a commercial airline pilot. It doesn't make commercial airline pilots any better. I mean, there's a lot of folks are intimidated by airline pilots, but it shouldn't be the case. We're all more or less the same, but I think there's a different mentality of somebody, casually flying their Piper Arrow. But if you haven't been trained to fly as an airline pilot, well, how do you train somebody to become more of a professional? And there's a lot of great GA people out there. It's just that how do you maintain that safety mentality? And, a lot of it starts with the flight instructor from that aspect. But I think you should bring up, and I'm going to help you segue into this, is your product taking that mentality a step further in the decision process.
Yeah, I appreciate the segue. So for our audience, what we're talking about is Earhart Avionics, and the big mindset that we're taking with this, and just like what you're talking about, the instructor pilot, And so a while back in my flying career, flying history, I did have some time as an instructor as well. I was in the backseat of a glider, and I would have students that were anywhere from their very first time flying a glider to this is their check ride, getting into being an instructor themselves, and developing a lot of proficiency with that. And one thing that I observed as this role of a flight instructor is that, if this was the center stick, it's obviously a microphone, but if this was the center stick for the I would go from having my hands resting here on the parachute to maybe a little bit closer to a little bit closer to I'm this close from intervening, but you're playing this calculation constantly of, intervention or automation can ensure outcome, but it could do so in a way that compromises skill development and competency, and there's this contextual awareness that goes into that. And I'm sure as a check airman, you've seen that so many times in your career as well of, what do you need to observe to know, hey, is it my time to put some sort of intervention in there or not? It's interestingly not that unlike being a parent of sometimes you need to let the kids fall. You need to sort of risk assess, hey, I'm going to let them learn a little bit here right now. And, we're going to take a little tumble and let's learn a little bit here. Anyway, that sliding scale is just fascinating. I mean, certainly you've seen that in your career as well.
Well, we talked about it as a check airman. My two favorite stories was one, well, for the most part, was as a 767 check airman. A lot of times I would get captains that came off the Super 80. So that thing on the ground is like a go-kart, versus the 767. There's a different sight picture for landing. And, it was always, like you said, in the back of a glider, when do I intervene? And you just knew inevitably that at some point that particular initial operating experience student was going to basically fly the thing right into the concrete. But how far do you let that happen? Do you just make it embarrassing? Is it going to be a point where, the wheels are going to come off the bus? People are going to be scared. So yeah, it was a skill that you had to develop to say, hey, this isn't going to work, pull back on the stick, so to speak. So that was always, one of my favorites. The other one was a story of I was checking out a brand new captain. We were going to fly from Kennedy to Bermuda. And the winds were at the limits. They were forecast to be at our crosswind limits. And the alternate was easy. We were just going to come back to Kennedy. But this new captain had carefully pulled up the weather and evaluated it, looked at it, and made a judgment call. Shortly after shaking my hand, he said, "It's your leg, Captain."
No kidding. On a check flight.
Check flight, on an initial operating experience flight. Because his judgment call was, I had more experience flying the airplane and I could convey information to him. I thought it was a very bold move on his part to say to a check airman, "No, I'm not flying this. You are."
Yeah. Interesting.
And I basically told him, because of that judgment skill that he impressed me with and demonstrated, I said, if you've really got to screw something up for the rest of this initial operating experience trip in order for me to down you on it.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was tremendous. I just thought it was great.
Well, and
the man is the chief pilot now in New York. Yeah.
So it went on to continue doing well. What I find really interesting about your Bermuda story is that you are talking about context in a way of some of the things you're observing and what it means to be a safe and a proficient pilot, and risk assessment and risk assessed decision making. Those are skills that go beyond stick and rudder and procedure. And, and it kind of gets at the thought that's been on my mind a lot lately is what makes a safe and competent pilot in 2026, and how much of that is something that evolves over time. And I draw a correlation to the automotive world a fair amount when I'm trying to think about that, because you look at what it is to be a proficient and safe vehicle operator. And I use vehicle operator on purpose because we're not really driving as much as we have in the past. We are starting to sort of operate the vehicles and sort of this stick and rudder equivalent, managing, right? Yeah. And sort of there's this positive correlation between when performance and capability necessitates an increase in complexity and automation, it drives down the hands-on component and introduces this sort of management of system, management of, the total mission that's going on. Have you seen something similar with that as well?
Well, it's something that I don't think is ever discussed in pilot training. You just develop it over time, over proficiency, over experience, flying. One of a gentleman that has retired way before me said, he goes, "You know what? it's not so much our skills that they're paying us for. It's for the fact of the decisions that we decide to make. It's like, no, thunderstorm's coming this way over the field. I'm not departing, and store. You don't even touch the yoke of the airplane to make a safe decision like that. So, but how would you coordinate? How would you take your product into that process? How would you help that process?
Yeah, and so one thing that we look at is how could we deconstruct what goes into a flight, and one of the best lessons I heard years ago on the most advanced or the best safety equipment in an aircraft on a cross country flight is a hotel reservation and a credit card. That's the best safety equipment you can have, and obviously said another way, it's knowing when to say no, and that's unlocking a very specific phase of that flight. That's unlocking the go, no go, the weather planning, the beginning phase of that. One way I love to envision that is sort of what are the fundamental phases of going on or are going into this mission? What phases are going into this from pre-flight and planning to even before that, the training and proficiency and managing that going into that. And things like sleep and drinking enough water and not drinking alcohol and all of those to just start layering on these are all the right behaviors going into even being able to think, okay, I'm going to start planning that flight. There's context there. Then you start planning the flight. There's context to that. There's location. There's how often have you flown in and out of that particular departure airport? How often are you flying right now? And sometimes not flying enough can have detrimental risk, but also sometimes flying too frequently, too hot can also introduce some different challenges, right? And there's a time to go, you got to pause for a second. Your ops tempo is very hot right now. And if we unpack that all the way through the pre-flight and planning to then ground operations to takeoff and departure and climb and cruise, and you unpack that end to end, it opens up this world of context. And what I love about systems and a well-integrated system, a system that's not only vertically integrated within its components, but integrated within where that information is coming from, we can do more than just show data to then put it all on the pilot and go, okay, here's all the data that's available. Now you have to process all of this within your mind. We can contextualize and convey as information of here's what you need to know phase by phase, component by component to make correct risk-associated decision-making, And there's a wealth of data available to pilots, but there's an art to presenting that data in a way that becomes value-added information. And
without it becoming overwhelming.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, one thing you see, I remember when I was working through my instrument rating and upgrading into a G7 series, often what I was struggling with was not only sort of the knobology of, okay, I know what I need to do, but what series of buttons and series of steps unpack that, but it's sort of developing that muscle memory so that I can get ahead of the aircraft and not get behind the aircraft, and one of the epiphany moments was I was going through this, and at the time I was wearing a smartwatch every time I flew, and it happened to be a smartwatch that would start logging a flight when I took off. It found the rate of climb, and then I would stop it when I was done. And I saw this. I would land, and I would be debriefing with my flight instructor. We'd be working through the phases of flight and the different maneuvers and the different procedures. And I would see there was a physiological component tied to proficiency, and that was my own heart rate. I would see of, hey, 12 minutes into the flight, I was doing whatever was going on. How did you feel about that? And I would look at it and go, yeah, you know what? I was stressed, and you know what? My body was physically responding to that. And so it's just, when you look at the human integration side of that, it starts to get really fascinating and how to stay ahead of the aircraft, how to not overwhelm crew. What are some things I would love your thoughts on this one? Staying ahead of the aircraft, staying ahead, and this cognitive burnout. What are some tips? What are some best practices you've seen over the years that can help with that burnout side, to help with the cognitive overload and battling that a little bit?
Well, like I said, all that information, especially now, it's so available, it can be overwhelming. I think, there should be more emphasis on the journey, especially for GA folks. There's a lot of really special people out there, sharp people that really want to be proficient, want to be skillful in flying an airplane, and they're competitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of professions, doctors, lawyers, that get into this, profession or into aviation. I don't want to call it a hobby, but they get into this and they really want to be good at it and proficient at it. So sometimes, it's best to just take a deep breath and step back and look at things. Here's an example. I think what's compelling to a lot of people with aviation and having an airplane is that ability and that freedom to get to where they want to go, whatever that purpose is. It's a wedding, it's a visit, whatever it is. Doing that planning a week ahead of time. Where am I going to stop for fuel?
Mm-hmm.
So on and so. I think that's good. And what you said about hotels and credit cards, it's interesting. I don't want to take the credit. I want to give it to a gentleman by the name of Gary Reeves, the guy in the pink shirt. He does a lot of, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he does a lot of the custom type instrument flying directly with students. And one of the things that he puts in his book, I think is fascinating, is about choosing an alternate. We all think of an alternate in terms of the requirements of weather and what time period in terms of fuel and gallons that we need to have that alternate. But we don't think about a realistic alternate. So with the airline, I had a lot of resources. I had my best resources as a captain was the guy or gal sitting in the right seat. After that, it was dispatch. It was the flight attendants in the back of the airplane. But if I knew I was going to face a weather situation, for instance, I had a snowstorm event at Kennedy, I knew probably an hour and a half out that I was going to go to Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. And the reason I knew that was because I could see everybody else, hear everybody else talking about places closer into Kennedy, and we're talking about gate space issues.
Yeah.
So in relative terms, Raleigh-Durham is not that far away from Kennedy, and that's where we ended up going. But it was already, okay, if I go into the holding pattern here, I'm going to do one turn or two. That's it. Then I'm leaving, right? So in a way, I had already done that sort of calculation. Well, with this gentleman, Gary Reeves, the guy in the pink shirt, he says, pick another alternate rather than just the legal alternate, or even if it's just realistic, pick an alternate that's halfway to your destination. Because if the weather starts to go downhill, what's the point? Why continue into a situation that is going to be potentially more challenging?
Yeah.
You talked about your heart rate with reference. Now here you are getting into a challenging situation. You're lower on fuel. Think of all of those stress factors. Why do it? Why not go, hey, here's my midpoint alternate. Should I just land here?
Yeah.
And that's a small finite example that kind of answers your question, but that's just one example of things to, listen, when you're proficient flying an airplane, as I was after 27,000 hours, most of it being at straight and level flight. So, you get comfortable with situations, you get comfortable with weather issues, with medical issues that you have on board and even emergency situations. So proficiency does help from that standpoint. But once again, I go back to think about making it a journey as opposed to a mission.
Yeah. One thing I love about the journey mindset as well, one, flying is incredible. It's remarkable that these planes can do what they can do. And so by taking this journey mindset, you are in a way, elevating that beauty of what's going on. You're appreciating it more. But the other aspect of it that I really like is the world of flying is highly dynamic. There's a lot of change that's going on, to include, let's say you're looking at all the different go or no-go decisions going into a particular mission. And let's say you're getting ready to take off and you go, you know what? I'm green throughout the entire flight. I'm green on everything going into that. I'm departing on a lower risk, green, type of a profile. But that doesn't necessarily mean during the duration of the flight, nothing will change, and And the information we have available to us can try to forecast out as much as it can. But, let's say you're on a 4-hour flight even, a lot can change in 4 hours. And, runway conditions can change, weather can change. But the things that can also change a little bit harder to see are, let's say you're navigating, complex airspace and complex procedures. Your own stress, your own bandwidth, your own burnout can change throughout that flight too, And I have one just personal dream that I'm hoping to see happen in the world is when we put all that context in there and in our system without unpacking, all the features and everything, we do in real time continue to evaluate the entire duration of the flight, even as it's underway. And one of my dreams is that at some point there will come a time when our system will alert the pilot of either one, hey, something later on in your flight has been changing, or two, take a breather. You're stressed. You're getting burnt out. Maybe that approach procedure that you have planned right now, you should look at something different, because I'm paying attention to all this other stuff that's going into it. And it's kind of like, it goes back to this, what would a flight instructor be looking at? And, if I'm seeing a student getting overwhelmed, getting stressed, sometimes I may say, hey, let's go do a hold, right? Let's just pause for a minute. Let's just slow down the burnout that's happening right now. Let's collect our thoughts. Let's prepare for what's happening next. And then let's get into that, And when the day comes when I think our system or a system can have that kind of insight into the human behind the controls and go, you know what? I need you to be here right now because we got something ahead of us. That's a system that's now taking the right information and really making it available, And
it's tough to quantify.
I think the technology is getting there.
It's tough to quantify that kind of thing. I think sort of a good analogy. I mean, we tend to get myopic. I mean, when we're focusing on a primary flight display, for instance, there's nothing else around us, in a big jet, you've got a big cockpit and you don't have to focus strictly on it unless you're involved in a specific type of approach or situation. What I I called my column for Flying Magazine Jump Seat. And not only was it sort of a reference to an inside knowledge and giving people insight to what I do for a living, but it also, what I found is most people can fly an airplane a hell of a lot better than the pilots if they're sitting on the jump seat because they have that expansive view. And sometimes you have to get your mind to that point where you can put yourself in a jump seat and not be so myopic about what you're doing with the airplane.
Yeah. And
it's a little philosophical, Nate. I'm sorry.
Well, but it's philosophical, but it becomes unbelievably practical. This, kind of hindsight has 20/20, or this external perspective has that, and I can't help but think about after action reports, after crash reports, right? And here very recently, Air Canada and the unfortunate collision on the ground. And it's so easy now to open up the aperture wide open and have all this perspective. And one thing in the Air Force pilot training world when we were in the glider program was, it was kind of like, hey, you can't debrief at 0 knot and 0 G and just assume that's what happened in real time. We have to acknowledge that when you're sitting in a debriefing room talking about something, everything about the context is different now. But if we just saw that happening, it's happening right now. It's in the news. Any thoughts on that?
Well, aside from the horrific tragedy to the whole thing, and 2 pilots no longer have a career ahead of them, and that flight attendant, I don't know how she survived. I can get myself in the head of not only the pilots, because here they are, they're cleared to land. They're focused on a wet runway. LaGuardia is 7,000 feet, no matter what runway you look at. And you want to get the damn thing stopped. And most of us want to get it stopped before that intersection if you're landing on runway 4. So your focus is where you're going to touch down and then getting the reversers on and getting on the brakes. The last thing in the world, even though you're trying to focus and be situationally aware of the transmissions that are going on, last thing in the world, you think that there's a ground vehicle about to cross in front of you. And there was nothing this crew could have done. There's going around would have made it worse. It would have made it more spectacular if they had done a ground go around, which is plausible, but not in the situation that they were at. And you could see the controllers. You could hear them, they were losing the situational awareness, the basic fact they had an aircraft landing on an active runway. And it's just, you can see it all. You just the same way with one of the watershed accidents was JFK Jr. The more you started peeling back the layers of the onion, you realize this guy was stressed out and he was putting himself into a challenging situation that nobody had advised him about. And because he had done it before, I mean, there was so many layers to that accident that one slice of cheese got in the way, we wouldn't be talking about it, right?
Yeah. And for those that aren't familiar with the cheese analogy, what we're talking about is sort of stacking all these intervention layers, right? And if we have the right procedure, the right communications, the right checklist, the right combination of safety layers, eventually there won't be one single point of failure, and inevitably, there's a gap somewhere, and we can try to engineer and document our way into an infallible way of doing this. But at the end of the day, it goes back to, this is a highly dynamic environment, and things are changing. Load is surging, and unfortunately, I'm the son of a career air traffic controller. I grew up with actually we had a scanner that we would put on the kitchen table growing up. And we just listened to air traffic control all day long. And it was kind of like, hey, that's Dad. He's at work today. And it was, some remote middle of Illinois airspace. But he worked at Chicago Center. So he was, obviously a larger component. So you may have talked to him at one point.
Sure, I did.
But yeah, and it's kind of like, can we put the right layers in there? Can we look at all the context that's going into that? And the thing that comes to mind when we're talking about that is, you've had an incredible career in aviation. I've been fortunate enough to fly on and off for 22 years at this point. For those that want to get into aviation, usually we started this with kind of an origin story question of hey, how did you get into this? And I've never met a pilot that couldn't come up with, I think this is kind of how it started. But there's this barrier to entry that is really challenging to overcome sometimes. And especially if you don't have aspirations to go on and fly commercially, it's very expensive getting into aviation, and it can be very overwhelming. I mean, if you look at the topics we've been talking about here today, these are complex, potentially overwhelming topics for someone going, hey, I don't even know how a plane stays in the air. I'm not even really sure what thrust and drag and lift and weight and how that calculus seems to make these things not fall out of the sky. And now I'm trying to figure out all of this. And then you unpack the safety layers and stacking that on, and it can be pretty overwhelming. Any thoughts on how we could make that more accessible, less without, we can't compromise safety. And maybe if we address safety first and foremost, but there's still more to be done. What are your thoughts on how we attack the accessibility aspect?
Well, once again, we're mitigators of risk, right? I mean, we can't control Mother Nature and other aspects of human nature. But I think, a lot of people, even as an adult I talk to, they're intimidated. They're overwhelmed with the fact that they walk into the cockpit of an airplane and it's just, they're the switches and the gauges and the circuit breakers, and it's just overwhelming to people. And young folks will just write it off because it isn't something I can get into, and it just reeks of being expensive, right? Well, I think the Young Eagles, taking folks for a ride, giving that first impression, trying to throw it out there and say, you can do this. There's ways to make it happen. You just got to enjoy it enough and feel passionate enough about to and ambitious enough to make it happen. But you can make it happen. And I guess education is really the short answer,
Okay. And educating on the path to doing it, how to find flying schools, how to find rentals, how to navigate insurance, and we were recently discussing, all the different, EAA has a lot of outreach going on as well, and introducing everyone to that. And that's where it ends up being a community effort and trying to break that down.
It's important. I mean, try to, whenever there was a kid that showed any interest in getting on an airplane, tried to spend time in the cockpit the best we could.
Mm-hmm.
That always made an impression. It's funny who you reach sometimes, but that was the way to do it. Of course, the adage was, when you grow up, do you want to be a pilot? The answer is you can't do both.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe we can do something about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Before we go, we've hit some heavy topics. We've worked through some of the complexities of this. At the end of the day, the world of aviation is incredible, and you've had the opportunity to travel the world and fly some incredible planes and meet, I'm sure, just an incredible community of folks in the aviation world. What stands out as some highlights, as some of the best things about flying?
Well, I mean, it's a small world. That's, I always tell aspiring airline pilots is, don't piss off the guy that's fueling your airplane, because he may be your chief pilot someday. And that's what I find, is that the common denominator of being a pilot, there's a camaraderie like there is, with being in the military. I think that's one of the great things about it. When I retired, we always say to each other, listen, we don't miss the circus, we miss the clowns. That's some of the exciting things, just the opportunity to be able to fly the airplanes that I did. The aspect is the challenge. I think there's something different every day. You don't want to be terrified, of course, but there's some that, like you said, that's very dynamic and fluid profession, and there's always something different. There's always something you can do better.
Yeah. Wow. And lifelong learning that goes with that, then, and then as an avid learner myself, I find that part really fascinating. Of there's always more, there's always something else, and that's incredible. Well, thanks again very much. You're not only an incredible pilot, you're an incredible voice in the world of aviation, and I really appreciate you being a part of podcast and what follows, and taking the time to meet with us today. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Glad to be here. Hope we get to do it again sometime.
Absolutely, that'd be great.